If lately you've felt that something fundamental has changed inside you, but you can't explain exactly what, pay close attention to what I'm about to share. Maybe you're walking down the street and suddenly feel a strange sensation of watching your own life from the outside, as if you were a character in a movie you're watching, not living. Or perhaps you've noticed that conversations that once energized you now completely drain you, and you simply can't care anymore about the dramas everyone around you seems to consider vital. This isn't depression. It's not pathological dissociation, and you're definitely not going crazy. It's something infinitely deeper and more transformative happening at the core of your consciousness operating system. Before we continue this revealing journey, if you're feeling these disturbing signs of awakening, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell, because what I'm going to share in the next few minutes might be the most important explanation ever received about what's happening with your perception of reality. And when I say important, I'm not exaggerating. I'm talking about finally understanding why you can no longer pretend to care about the same things, why your emotions seem to pass through you instead of consuming you, and especially why you've started to notice that your thoughts sound more like old programming than absolute truth. It's necessary to be transparent here. The accounts of thousands of people around the world who have gone through this process, documented in clinical studies and contemplative traditions, describe an initial phase where sanity itself seems to be at stake. Nothing makes sense the way it used to. The ambitions that once drove these people were revealed to be empty. The worries that dominated their days turned out to be distractions without real substance. The testimonies are consistent. It was terrifying at first for almost everyone, until understanding of what was really happening began to emerge. Researchers like Stanislav Graf have called this a spiritual emergency, distinguishing it from psychiatric emergency, although the initial symptoms may appear similar. What's happening to you, and what some quantum physicists and philosophers of mind, like Amit Goswami, interpret as a critical moment of consciousness transition. Now, it's important to clarify, when I talk about quantum physics applied to consciousness, I'm entering the territory of philosophical interpretation, not established scientific facts. Goswami proposes a view called monistic idealism, where consciousness would be fundamental and matter emerges from it. It's a fascinating hypothesis, but it remains a hypothesis, not scientific consensus. What neuroscience can confirm with more certainty is that you're experiencing real changes in how your brain processes information. It's a reconfiguration in the way your neural networks interact, particularly in what we call the default mode network. This network, discovered by neuroscientist Marcus Rachel, is responsible for your sense of self, for the internal narrative you tell about who you are, and when it begins to change its activity, your entire perception of identity and reality changes with it. You're literally changing neural frequency, moving from a state of mechanical, reactive, conditioned consciousness to a state of expanded awareness where you begin to perceive that your previous identifications were constructions, not absolute truths. It's as if you'd been living inside a character for so long that you forgot it was a character, and now you're starting to remember that there's an observer behind the mask. This sensation of watching your life instead of being completely immersed in it has a technical name in contemplative neuroscience. It's called metacognitive disidentification. Studies with long-term meditators show consistent alterations in brain regions associated with self-reference, particularly a decrease in activity in the medial prefrontal cortex during deep meditative states. But what neuroscientists are still trying to fully understand is the subjective experience that accompanies these neural changes. When you begin to feel like the observer of your own experience, what's happening neurologically is that your consciousness is detaching from the habitual patterns of identification that were built from the moment of your birth, layer by layer, through social conditioning, formative experiences, education, all the programming that told you who you should be, how you should think, what you should value and desire. And here's the part nobody prepares you for. This process is profoundly uncomfortable, not necessarily physically, although some experience somatic symptoms, but existentially. Because while your consciousness expands, while you begin to perceive the automatic patterns that govern not just your life, but the lives of everyone around you, you're still living in a world that operates on the old frequency. Your bills still need to be paid. Your relationships still demand the old, predictable version of you. Your job still expects you to care about metrics and objectives that have completely lost existential meaning. You're literally living between two worlds, with one foot in what we might call consensus reality and another exploring territories of consciousness that most people don't even know exist. But here's what absolutely transforms everything. This liminal phase. This space between worlds that seems so uncomfortable and disorienting isn't an error in the system. It's the most important feature of awakening, because it's exactly in this apparent void, in this moment where nothing makes sense the old way, but you haven't yet established a new way of making sense, that something extraordinary begins to happen with your capacity to perceive and interact with reality. Your ability to create your experience of reality is no longer operating through conventional channels of effort, control, and external manipulation. What's emerging now is something contemplative traditions have known for millennia, but which neuroscience has only recently begun to map and understand. When you feel this disconnection from your old identity, when things that once mattered simply evaporate into apparent irrelevance, this isn't apathy or depression, it's a deep neural recalibration. Your nervous system is undergoing a fundamental restructuring that first requires the loosening of obsolete neural connections, of patterns you've repeated so many times they become neural highways. Think about this for a moment, and I mean really contemplate it. Don't just intellectually process it. Every time you feel that strange sensation of no longer belonging to the contexts that once defined your life, what's happening neurologically is fascinating. Your neural activation patterns are changing, leaving the deep grooves created by repetition and exploring new connections. It's as if your brain were doing a complete renovation, but instead of closing for remodeling, it continues operating while rebuilding its foundations. Donald Hoffman, cognitive scientist at the University of California, proposes something provocative with his interface theory of perception. According to him, we don't perceive reality as it is, but through an adaptive interface shaped by evolution for our survival, not to perceive truth. It's like using a computer desktop. The icons aren't the real files, they're useful representations that allow us to interact with a computational reality too complex to process directly. Now, this is still a developing theory, not an established fact, but it offers a powerful metaphor for understanding your current experience. When you begin to awaken, it's as if you're perceiving for the first time that you've been using an interface, not directly accessing reality. And this perception is simultaneously liberating and destabilizing, because your entire life was built assuming the interface was the total reality. The anxiety many experience during this awakening process isn't a disorder, although it can certainly feel like one. It's the result of a temporary mismatch between the speed of change in your consciousness and your nervous system's ability to adapt. Your nervous system was biologically programmed through millions of years of evolution to operate in survival mode, identifying threats, competing for resources, keeping you alive in a world perceived as fundamentally hostile. Now, suddenly, new forms of processing are emerging, carrying information about interconnection, about possibilities beyond survival, about dimensions of experience that don't fit in the old processing categories. What neuroscience is discovering now, through extensive studies with advanced meditators and people in non-ordinary states of consciousness, is that the brain has a much greater capacity for reorganization than we imagined. The concept of neuroplasticity, which already revolutionized our understanding of the brain, is being expanded to include much more fundamental changes than simply learning new skills or recovering from injuries. The neural networks that sustain what we call ego identity, particularly the default mode network, can be literally reconfigured. Studies show that long-term meditators have measurable structural alterations in brain areas associated with self-reference, emotional regulation, and attention, not through superficial positive thinking or repetitive affirmations, but through consistent exposure to states of consciousness that transcend habitual processing patterns. Every time you allow yourself to experience the sensation of being the observer, instead of struggling to return to the familiar role of fully identified protagonist, every moment you accept the discomfort of not knowing instead of immediately filling it with old certainties or distractions, you're literally creating new neural pathways. These new pathways have the capacity to sustain forms of consciousness that were impossible in the previous neural configuration. And it's precisely here, in this moment of radical acceptance of the process, even without fully understanding it, that something even deeper begins to reveal itself about the nature of your experience and your role in it. The fundamental nature of your experience of reality isn't necessarily what the traditional materialist model suggests. Now, I'm going to be very careful here, because it's important to distinguish between what science has established, what's being investigated, and what remains in the realm of philosophical speculation. The double-slit experiment in quantum physics demonstrates that particles behave differently when observed, existing as probability waves until the moment of measurement. This is an established scientific fact, but the interpretation that human consciousness causes the collapse of the wave function, that's a philosophical extrapolation that some physicists and philosophers make, but it's not scientific consensus. What we call observation in quantum physics refers to any interaction that causes quantum decoherence, not necessarily human consciousness. It's crucial to understand this distinction to avoid falling into pseudo-scientific mysticism. That said, the subjective experience of awakening you're living is absolutely real and is correlated with measurable changes in your brain. You need to understand something that can change how you relate to every moment of your existence, even if the exact mechanisms are still being investigated by science. Your brain doesn't necessarily generate your consciousness in the simple way the traditional materialist model suggests. This is a question still open in neuroscience and philosophy of mind, known as the hard problem of consciousness. We know there are correlations between brain states and consciousness states, but the exact nature of that relationship remains one of the great mysteries of science. When you begin to experience these awakening states, when these strange symptoms of disidentification begin to intensify, what's happening neurologically is that you're accessing processing modes that normally remain dormant in ordinary consciousness. It's as if you'd been living in a house using only a few rooms, and now doors to entire areas you didn't even know existed are opening. Now, pay attention, because this is crucial to understanding your experience. The reason you can no longer emotionally invest in everyday dramas the same way, the reason the ambitions that once motivated you now seem strangely empty, isn't because you've lost something valuable. It's because you're gaining perspective. It's like climbing a mountain. As you gain altitude, things that seemed huge and important in the valley begin to look smaller, not because they've diminished, but because you're seeing from a broader viewpoint. Researchers like Robin Carhart-Harris have proposed the entropic brain model, suggesting that expanded consciousness states are characterized by greater neural entropy, that is, greater flexibility and less predictability in brain activation patterns. This can explain why these states are often accompanied by both creative insights and anxiety. Your brain is operating outside the predictable patterns that normally provide a sense of security and control. The perceptual interface through which you experience the world, to use Halfman's metaphor, is being updated. But unlike a software update that happens overnight while you sleep, this update is happening while you're trying to continue using the system. That's why there can be glitches, moments of confusion, experiences that don't fit into the old categories of understanding. This perceptual update process isn't uniform or linear. There will be days when you feel completely awake, seeing through all illusions, experiencing a clarity you've never known before. And there will be days when you question everything, when the discomfort of uncertainty becomes almost unbearable, when you wish you could simply return to the comfortable ignorance of before. This oscillation is normal. It's expected. It's part of the integration process. A fascinating aspect that research is revealing that people going through these awakening states frequently report experiences of increased synchronicity, significantly coincidental events that defy purely causal explanation. Although science doesn't yet have a complete explanation for this phenomenon, some theories suggest it may be related to changes in how the brain processes patterns and attributes meaning. When the default mode network is less active, as happens in meditative or expanded consciousness states, other neural networks can create connections and perceive patterns that would normally be filtered out. This is exactly why so many people beginning to awaken report that reality seems to respond in mysterious ways to their internal states, not necessarily because they're magically manifesting external events, but because their perception is tuned to perceive connections and meanings that were always present but invisible to the previous mode of perception. But there's something important I need to share about this expanded perception, something many people discover only through difficult experience. The awakening process often involves what some traditions call the dark night of the soul, and neuroscience is beginning to understand why. When the default mode network, that network that maintains your cohesive and predictable sense of self, begins to loosen its control, it's not just liberation you experience. It's also a form of psychological death, and I'm not using the word death lightly. Neuroimaging studies in people using psychedelics, which produce states similar to spiritual awakening, show a dramatic decrease in activity in the medial prefrontal cortex, the region most associated with self-referential processing. It's literally as if the command center that kept your narrative identity functioning goes temporarily offline. And while this can lead to experiences of unity and transcendence, it can also be profoundly destabilizing. The consistent accounts of spiritual practitioners through the centuries, now validated by neuroscientific studies, describe this phase as one of the most challenging of the human journey. The dissolution of ego structures isn't a gentle process of transcendence where you serenely float beyond identification. For most, it's more like a controlled demolition where every protective wall built up throughout life, every defense mechanism developed to navigate a complex and sometimes traumatic world, needs to be examined and often dismantled. And while this happens, while the old structures collapse, there's a period where you're completely vulnerable, psychologically naked, without the familiar armor, but still without stabilization in a new way of being. It's in this liminal space that many people experience what can seem like anxiety symptoms or even dissociation. It's crucial to understand that while these experiences can be a normal part of the transformation process, if you're experiencing significant suffering or dysfunction in your daily life, seeking professional support from a therapist familiar with spiritual emergencies can be extremely valuable. What neuroscience has discovered studying these states is both fascinating and validating of the subjective experience. During processes of deep consciousness transformation, activity in different brain regions changes dramatically. Not only does the default mode network decrease its activity, but connectivity between brain regions that don't normally communicate directly increases. It's as if invisible barriers between different departments of your mind were temporarily removed, allowing a flow of information and integration that wasn't possible before. This is why so many people in the midst of awakening report a paradoxical range of experiences, feeling more alive than ever, while simultaneously feeling that something essential is dying, experiencing consciousness expansion, along with moments of deep contraction and fear, having brilliant insights alternating with periods of complete mental confusion. These paradoxes aren't signs that something is wrong. They're signs that a fundamental reorganization is occurring now, and this is absolutely crucial for you to understand. What's changing isn't just your psychology. Longitudinal studies with meditators show structural changes in the brain. Gray matter in certain regions increases, white matter connecting different areas becomes more efficient and functional connectivity patterns reorganize. You're not just thinking differently, your brain is literally rebuilding itself. But here's something that's rarely discussed. Not everyone who begins this process completes it in a healthy way. Some people get stuck in what we might call spiritual bypassing, using spiritual concepts to avoid dealing with unresolved traumas or practical responsibilities. Others develop what psychologists call spiritual ego inflation, where identification with the small self is replaced by an equally problematic identification with being awakened or special. Healthy integration requires what psychologist John Wellwood called groundwork, the willingness to face and integrate shadow aspects of the psyche, process old traumas, and develop a healthy relationship with both the transcendent dimension and practical daily life. It's not about escaping the human condition, but about inhabiting it more fully, with greater awareness and less automatic identification. A particularly interesting phenomenon that researchers have observed is what happens with time processing during these states. The insula, a brain region involved in interoceptive awareness and temporal perception, shows altered activity patterns. Many people report that time seems to dilate or contract, that the present moment becomes more vivid and expanded, or that the linear distinction between past, present, and future begins to seem less solid. This doesn't mean objective time has changed, but that your perception and processing of it are transforming. And this change in temporal perception often accompanies a change in the perception of causality. Events that once seemed rigidly connected by cause and effect begin to reveal more subtle connections, more complex patterns, a web of interrelations that the linear mind had filtered in favor of a simpler, more manageable narrative. As this process of neural and perceptual reorganization continues, something remarkable begins to emerge. What many contemplative traditions call witness consciousness or observer has specific neurological correlates. Studies show that experienced meditators develop the ability to maintain meta-awareness, awareness of awareness, even during complex activities. It's like developing a new perceptual organ, one that can observe not just the content of experience, but the process of experiencing itself. This enhanced metacognitive capacity isn't just an interesting mental trick. It fundamentally alters how you relate to your thoughts, emotions, and experiences. Instead of being automatically captured and identified with every thought or feeling that arises, you develop what we might call psychological space, a buffer between stimulus and response where conscious choice becomes possible. Viktor Frankl, Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, spoke about this when he said, "Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." What the awakening process does is expand that space, make it more accessible, more habitable. But here's what separates those who successfully integrate these changes from those who get stuck in dysfunctional states: the ability to maintain what psychologists call executive function even while experiencing non-ordinary states. It's the difference between having mystical experiences and developing embodied wisdom. Recent research suggests the key may lie in what we call psychological flexibility, the ability to adapt to fluctuating situations and shifting demands, while staying connected to core values. People who successfully navigate the awakening process seem to develop a paradoxical way of being, deeply rooted while infinitely adaptable, fully present while not identified, engaged in life while not attached to outcomes. A fascinating aspect emerging from research is the role of the autonomic nervous system in this process. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory suggests our nervous system has different states: fight, flight, freeze, and safe social engagement. Many people in the awakening process experience dramatic changes in how their nervous system responds to stimuli. Old triggers may lose their power, while completely new sensitivities may emerge. This is why many people report changes in their social needs during awakening. Relationships that were central may feel draining or irrelevant, while connections with people in similar processes become deeply nourishing. This isn't necessarily about judging others as less awakened, but about energetic resonance and frequency compatibility. To use a metaphor, the food you crave, the environments you seek, the types of stimulation you can tolerate, all of this can change dramatically. Many people report increased sensitivity to crowds, need for periods of silence and solitude, changes in sleep patterns, alterations in appetite. Your system is literally recalibrating its relationship with all aspects of experience. One of the most intriguing and least understood phenomena is what some people experience as downloads of information or insights that seem to come from beyond the usual thinking mind. While we don't have a complete scientific explanation for this, one possibility is that it represents access to unconscious processing or forms of implicit knowledge that normally aren't accessible to ordinary consciousness. Psychologist William James spoke about consciousness as a stream, a continuous flow. But what awakening reveals is that there are many streams, many flows of consciousness operating simultaneously, and normally we're tuned to only a very narrow channel. The awakening process is like expanding your perceptual bandwidth, beginning to receive multiple channels simultaneously. It's crucial to understand, however, that more information doesn't always mean greater clarity. Many people feel overwhelmed by the amount of perceptual input and insight they begin to receive. It's like trying to drink from a fire hose. Developing discernment, the ability to filter and integrate information usefully, becomes essential, and this brings us to a fundamental question. How do you stabilize these new capacities and insights in a way that serves not just your own development, but contributes to collective well-being? Because genuine awakening is never just about personal transcendence. The stabilization and integration of these profound consciousness changes require what we can call dedicated practice with radical gentleness. It's not about forcing yourself towards some idealized state of enlightenment, but about creating consistent conditions that support the natural reorganization that's trying to happen. Research shows it takes an average of 45 to 66 days of consistent practice to establish new neural patterns. But when we're talking about changes at the level of consciousness awakening, we're looking at a process that can take years to fully integrate. What determines whether someone successfully integrates these changes or gets stuck in dysfunctional states? Research is beginning to identify some key factors. First, the presence of a regular contemplative practice, whether meditation, yoga, qigong, or another form of somatic awareness cultivation. Second, some form of community or social support that understands and validates the experience. Third, the ability to maintain basic functioning in daily life while allowing the transformation process. There's a delicate balance here. On one hand, you need to honor the depth of what's happening, give it space and time to unfold. On the other, you can completely abandon your responsibilities or relationships. It's what meditation teacher Jack Cornfield calls after the ecstasy, the laundry. After the ecstasy, the laundry. Enlightenment doesn't exempt you from participating in ordinary human life. One of the biggest challenges people face is what happens when they return to their familiar environments after expansion experiences. Family, friends, colleagues who haven't gone through similar changes may not understand or may even actively resist the changes they see in you. This can create a painful form of isolation, where you feel alienated from those you love, but haven't yet established new connections with people on similar journeys. This is where the wisdom of not evangelizing becomes crucial. The impulse to share your discoveries, to awaken others, can be strong. But experience shows this rarely works and often creates resistance and distance. The most powerful changes you can make are in how you show up in the world, not in what you preach about it. Interestingly, research on what we call emotional contagion and mirror neurons suggests that states of consciousness can be transmitted non-verbally. When you're genuinely at peace, present, and non-reactive, this affects the field around you. People may not know why they feel calmer in your presence, but they feel it. This is a much more effective way to teach than any words. As integration continues, many people discover their life priorities change fundamentally. Careers built on egoic ambition may lose their appeal. Relationships based on mutual need or codependence may dissolve. But what emerges in their place often has a quality of greater authenticity and alignment. You may discover new talents or passions that were dormant. Relationships may become deeper and more genuine, based on real resonance rather than social obligation. A particularly interesting phenomenon researchers have observed is how the awakening process affects creativity, with the default mode network less dominant and greater communication between different brain regions. Many people experience a flowering of creative expression. This makes neurological sense. Creativity often emerges from the ability to make non-obvious connections, to see patterns where others see chaos, to access flow states where the ego editor gets out of the way. But perhaps the deepest change is in how you relate to suffering, both your own and others. Awakening doesn't eliminate pain or life's difficulty. If anything, it may initially make you more sensitive to them. But it fundamentally changes your relationship with these experiences. Instead of suffering being something to avoid at all costs or completely identify with, it becomes another texture in the tapestry of experience, neither good nor bad, simply present. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent or detached in the sense of not caring. On the contrary, many people report feeling more deeply, but without the additional layer of mental resistance that transforms pain into suffering. It's the difference between the clean pain of direct experience and the dirty pain of our stories about experience. Compassion, both for yourself and others, often emerges naturally from this state. When you see through the illusion of total separation, when you directly experience the interconnection of all life, compassion isn't a moral choice you make. It's a spontaneous response, as natural as pulling your hand from fire. And so we arrive at the crucial point. If you're experiencing these signs, if something in this script resonates deeply with your lived experience, you have a choice. You can treat this as just another interesting piece of information and continue trying to force yourself back into the old patterns. Or you can recognize this moment for what it is, an invitation to a journey of genuine transformation. The awakening has already begun. The only question is whether you'll collaborate with it or resist. And if there's anything the collective experience of thousands who've gone through this process teaches us, it's this: resistance only prolongs the discomfort. Conscious surrender, with discernment and adequate support, accelerates integration. So if you're ready for this journey, do 3 things. First, subscribe and activate notifications to continue receiving support in this process. Second, establish some form of daily contemplative practice, even if just 5 minutes of conscious breath observation. Third, and perhaps most importantly, be gentle with yourself. This process isn't a race, it's a metamorphosis, and metamorphoses take the time they need to take. In the comments, share which of these signs you're experiencing. Not because I need to know, but because the act of publicly naming and acknowledging what's happening to you is a powerful step in the journey. Each comment isn't just a sentence. It's a coherent signal added to the field. You're not just watching a video, you're actively participating in the creation of a new collective consciousness. You're not alone in this. Thousands are going through similar transformations right now. And together, we're creating a field of consciousness that supports collective awakening. The field is waiting. The choice is yours. What will you choose?